The temple crouched at the edge of the ravine as it always had, leaning into itself like an old man guarding secrets he no longer remembered choosing to keep. Its roof tiles were cracked and uneven, moss filling the gaps where rain had carved long channels of rot. Wind slid through the open corridors and carried with it the scent of damp wood, incense long burned away, and something older that clung to the stones. The sculptor sat where he often did, hunched over his work, the sound of metal against metal, slow and patient. Each strike echoed faintly through the hollow structure, as if the temple itself listened. The idols around him stared with worn faces, their features softened by time and touch. They had seen blood, prayers, and long silences. None of them spoke now, but the quiet felt crowded, as though the past refused to leave. A shinobi returned to the temple before dawn, stepping lightly across the warped planks. His presence disturbed the air more than the dust, and the sculptor did not look up. He had learned the shape of that silence, the weight of that footfall. The shinobi carried the smell of ash and iron, and beneath it the faint trace of rain. He paused near the entrance, eyes drawn to the Buddha statue that rested there, its surface cracked but calm. Kneeling, he placed his hands together, not in reverence exactly, but in acknowledgement. The temple was not a place of peace, it was a place of pause. Outside, the valley groaned as wind pressed through the trees, and somewhere far below, water struck stone again and again, endlessly patient. The sculptor spoke without lifting his head. His voice was rough, scraped raw by years of smoke and unsaid words. He asked nothing about victory or failure. Instead, he muttered about the wood being stubborn, about how rot could hide beneath a surface that looked sound. The shinobi listened. He always did. The sculptor's hands trembled slightly as he worked, carving another Buddha from a block that had once been part of the temple itself. Every shaving that fell to the floor carried a memory, or so the sculptor believed. He had taken to using the temple's own bones, as if trying to make it remember what it was meant to be. The shinobi wondered if the temple was listening more closely now, fed piece by piece into new shapes. As the morning crept in, light filtered through the broken walls and caught the dust in the air. The temple brightened without warming. Birds avoided the place, and even insects seemed hesitant to linger. The sculptor finally set his tools aside and flexed his fingers, staring at the half-finished statue. The fog had not yet lifted when the shinobi returned. He moved along the worn planks with practiced silence, his footsteps nearly swallowed by the lingering mist that clung to the temple's wooden beams. The air was thicker than usual, and each inhale carried the bitter tang of damp stone. The sculptor's hands were already busy, scraping away splintered wood from the base of a collapsed pillar. The scrape of metal against wood rang sharper in the stillness than the shinobi expected, and he noticed the way the sculptor's movements had grown slower, more deliberate. Years of practice had refined his craft, but the body, even a skilled body, betrayed age in quiet ways. "Something came through the night," the sculptor said without looking up. His voice was rough as gravel, softened slightly by the early mist. "There are deep shadows in this temple. Do not allow them to follow you." He did not elaborate, but the tension in his shoulders told the shinobi everything he needed to know.
Shadows moved differently in the temple now, sharper and more defined, as if the fog itself obeyed some unseen command. The shinobi's eyes scanned the perimeter, noting where the tiles had shifted and where the wind pressed unnaturally against the broken walls. The unfinished Buddha had been moved slightly, as though nudged by an unseen hand. The shinobi's gaze lingered on it for a moment, noting the subtle tilt of its head and the way the light caught its unfinished features. The sculptor muttered something about the weight of memory, and the shinobi understood immediately. The temple was alive in a way that went beyond stone and wood. Every crack and every missing tile held an echo of the past, of fire and shadow, of prayers and blood. Hours passed without the sun breaking the fog, and the valley below remained hidden. The sound of water striking stone was louder than usual, as though the ravine itself had grown restless. The sculptor worked silently, carving away at another piece of the temple, shaping fragments of old beams into smaller statues. The shinobi watched, waiting for some sign of movement beyond the wind. When one finally came, it was subtle. A shadow flickered just beyond the edge of the veranda, moving against the fog like a living silhouette. The sculptor glanced up, eyes narrowing, and the shadow vanished before the shinobi could determine its form. "They are drawn to this place," the sculptor said quietly, setting down his chisel. His voice carried a weight that the shinobi had learned to respect. "Not all that comes here leaves." He paused, as though choosing his next words carefully. "The temple remembers what it should not, and sometimes it calls those who are still alive to bear witness." The shinobi tightened the strap of his armor and checked his blade. The fog outside was unnaturally thick, clinging to the steps and curling around the temple pillars. Every sense on alert, he moved silently along the veranda, scanning the edge of the roof for movement. He felt the temple watching him, as if the cracks and splintered beams were eyes, as if every idol whispered in a language older than memory. He could not shake the feeling that the unfinished Buddha, perched among his companions, had shifted slightly again. It was as though the temple itself had nudged it into his line of sight, waiting for him to see. By midday, the fog began to thin, and the sun cast weak light over the ravine. The temple's broken roof absorbed it in patches, leaving shadows that seemed almost deliberate. The shinobi descended the steps to the courtyard, careful of the moss-slicked stones. He paused near the center, where the remnants of a stone lantern lay shattered, and traced the cracks with his eyes. Fire had touched this place long ago. Not all of it had been consumed, and some of the embers still lingered beneath the surface, waiting for a spark. The sculptor emerged from the temple proper, carrying a bundle of small carvings he had made over the morning. Each one was different, yet each bore the same serene expression, though incomplete. He placed them carefully on the edge of the veranda. "They will not remain still for long. The longer this temple—"
The morning air was damp, and the valley lay hidden beneath a rolling white fog that refused to lift. The shinobi moved along the veranda with measured steps, his senses alert to every shift in the wind, every creak in the wooden beams. The temple seemed heavier than before, as though the very stones were pressing down with intent. He paused at the threshold where the last night's shadows had gathered, noting the faint marks on the planks that suggested movement, too deliberate to be wind, too fleeting to be animal. The sculptor was already at work, hunched over a block of warped wood, chisel in hand, the rhythm of his strikes deliberate and precise.
Dust floated in the morning light, catching briefly before settling again. "You feel it too, don't you?" the sculptor asked without lifting his head. His voice was quiet, carrying a weight that made the shinobi turn fully. "The temple does not forget. It watches even when no one is here. It tests patience, loyalty, courage." He scraped another shaving from the block and held it up to the light, examining its curve. "The fog is not natural, not entirely. It carries the memory of what has burned and what has bled. It clings to the living the same as the dead." The shinobi nodded slowly. He had long stopped expecting comfort from the sculptor's words. They were warnings wrapped in quiet observations, never commands, never advice. The temple pressed in all directions, not with walls or doors, but with a persistent sense of expectation. Every idol in the hall, every carved Buddha lining the veranda seemed to hold its gaze on him. The unfinished Buddha watched with an almost human curiosity, its face incomplete, yet strangely alert. By midday, the fog had begun to curl through the temple's interior, drifting along the broken floorboards and splintered beams. Somewhere beneath the surface of the temple, he felt it, a subtle tremor of memory, like a heartbeat pressing through stone. The sculptor, already in the hall, had begun carving again, producing small statues from broken remnants of the temple itself. Each one seemed to absorb a piece of the old structure, preserving it in a new form, as though the temple's decay was being transferred into his hands. A sudden sound froze him mid-step. A low, scraping noise, deliberate and slow, echoed from the far side of the hall. He crouched slightly, one hand brushing the hilt of his blade. The sculptor did not react immediately, but the rhythm of his carving faltered just a fraction, the pause long enough to be noticed. The scraping grew closer, circling the hall, brushing along the walls and pillars, but never fully revealing itself. Shadows deepened unnaturally where the light fell weakly through broken tiles. The shinobi moved toward the sound, every sense sharpened, and glimpsed a fleeting motion at the edge of perception, an indistinct shape, dark and shifting, passing behind a collapsed beam. "They are curious," the sculptor murmured, voice low, almost to himself. "The temple tests, yes, but also remembers. It will allow some things to pass and bar others forever. Do not be fooled by what seems absent." He returned to his work with a careful intensity, chiseling the wood into a small, serene face. The shinobi's eyes flicked toward the unfinished Buddha, and he thought he saw its head tilt ever so slightly, following the shadow's movement. It was impossible, and yet undeniable. Hours passed. The scraping ceased, replaced by a quiet vibration through the floorboards and stone. The shinobi kept to the edges of the hall, attentive to the air, the fog, and the subtle signs of the temple's presence. The sculptor paused again, placing a completed carving among the others. "Every piece carries a memory," he said. "Some are meant to hold peace, others warnings. This temple remembers fire, blood, the living, and it waits for the next." The sun was low when the wind. The valley below remained hidden beneath a thick, roiling fog as the shinobi approached the temple once more. The path was slick with moisture, and the sound of water striking stone far beneath the steps echoed faintly through the mist. Each footfall seemed louder than it should have been, as if the temple itself were listening for the first sign of intrusion. The sculptor was already at work near the entrance, his back bent over a block of wood, chisel in hand,
but the rhythm of his strikes carried a tension the shinobi had not noticed before. The air felt heavier than usual, pressing against the chest, and even the faint smell of smoke and incense that clung to the temple could not mask the presence lurking just beyond perception. "You have felt it, haven't you?" the sculptor asked without looking up. His voice was softer than usual, but carried a strange intensity. "The temple remembers more when you do not expect it. The fog is thick with memory. It carries those who have passed, those who have fallen, and those who linger between. It tests the living, and it will not relent." He held up a piece of carved wood, a small, serene figure in mid-gesture, and the light from the broken roof caught its unfinished face in brief glimmers. The shinobi nodded, aware of the subtle movement in the shadows around the pillars and idols, a quiet restlessness that grew with every step he took deeper into the temple. By midday, the fog pressed through the broken windows and collapsed walls, curling along the floorboards like living smoke. The shinobi moved cautiously through the main hall, noting the deepening shadows and the subtle shifting marks on the warped wood. Somewhere in the corner, he thought he saw movement, a fleeting silhouette that vanished as soon as he blinked. The sculptor remained at his work, carving steadily, but the pause in his rhythm betrayed a tension that had taken root in the very air. The statues lining the hall seemed to lean slightly forward, their worn faces intent, as if they were straining to witness some unseen event. The unfinished Buddha watched from its perch, silent, yet strangely aware, as if it too was waiting. The first sound came suddenly, a scraping, low and deliberate, circling the hall, echoing off broken tiles and warped beams. The shinobi's hand went instinctively to his blade. The sculptor did not stop carving, but his hum of concentration faltered, a brief hesitation in the rhythm. The scraping grew closer, moving around corners, brushing along the edges of pillars and idols. It did not announce itself with breath or roar. It was patient, deliberate, testing both presence and reaction. The statues seemed to react, leaning imperceptibly toward the sound, their carved faces twisting ever so slightly in the flickering light. The temple itself seemed alive with intent, pressing down in quiet pressure that neither air nor fog could alleviate. "It watches," whispered the sculptor, voice low. "Not all that moves here seeks life or death. Some seek proof, proof that memory endures, that what was lost is not forgotten. You feel the pull, do you not?" The shinobi did not reply, understanding the weight of the words. To enter the temple was to submit to its memory. Every shadow, every flicker of fog, every subtle movement was a test, a measure of endurance and awareness. The past clung to the walls like moss, and the present was as delicate as a breath in a hall of echoes. As the afternoon deepened, the fog seemed to thicken unnaturally, curling through hallways and spilling into rooms that had long been abandoned. The sculptor worked without pause, shaping fragments of wood and stone into small statues, each holding a fragment of memory. The shinobi moved through the temple, scanning corners and broken beams for movement. The scraping returned, louder and sharper now, circling the hallways in a deliberate pattern. Shadows stretched. The fog hung thick over the ravine, pressing against the temple's broken walls like a living thing. The shinobi's steps were careful, measured, each one carrying the weight of countless memories he did not fully understand. The sculptor was at his workbench near the entrance, his hands moving with quiet purpose over a piece of warped wood. The air was heavier than it had been before, as if the temple itself had been waiting for this day. Shadows clung to corners with insistence, curling along broken beams, and the faint echo of distant scraping lingered beneath the wind. The temple's memory was restless, and the living could feel its pull more sharply than ever. "You have returned," the sculptor said without looking up, voice rough with age and intent. "This is no ordinary visit. The temple remembers more when the living witness. It tests patience, courage, and memory itself. The fog, it is thicker today because the past grows restless. It seeks recognition." He held up a small, unfinished statue, its face serene but incomplete. The shinobi nodded silently. He had long stopped expecting comfort from the sculptor's words. They were reminders, warnings, statements of fact. The temple did not merely observe, it pressed against the living, demanding acknowledgement of its memory. By midday, the fog pressed through the halls like liquid, curling around pillars, seeping under doors, and pooling in shadowed corners. The shinobi moved through the temple cautiously, each footfall deliberate, scanning the warped floorboards and broken beams. Somewhere in the corner of the hall, a movement caught his eye, a fleeting shadow that shifted and disappeared before he could focus. The sculptor worked steadily, carving small figures from the remnants of the temple itself. Each held a fragment of memory, a remnant of what the temple had endured. The statues lining the halls seemed more alert than ever, their worn faces straining to witness the unseen, their presence pressing subtly against the living. A low, deliberate scraping began in the distance, circling the hallways. The shinobi's hand tightened around the hilt of his blade. The sculptor continued his work, but the rhythm faltered, betraying the tension he felt. The scraping grew closer, brushing along pillars, whispering across floorboards, circling the room in deliberate arcs. Shadows twisted unnaturally in the fading light, lengthening and bending as if alive. The unfinished Buddha's head shifted slightly, tilting toward the movement. The temple's memory was reaching, not merely testing, but drawing the living into its past. "It is here," the sculptor whispered, voice tense and urgent. "Not to harm, but to demand witness. The temple remembers fire, blood, prayers, and silence. It waits for acknowledgement. Only then will it rest." The shinobi's eyes narrowed, scanning the hallways. The scraping became sharper, closer, and the fog thickened, curling along the broken walls like a serpent. The statues leaned forward slightly, the carved eyes appearing to follow the movement. Every shadow seemed to move with intent, and the temple itself pressed inward, as if to collapse around the truth it had preserved for centuries. Night came swiftly, heavier than before, suffocating in its insistence. The valley vanished beneath a roiling blanket of fog, and the temple seemed to expand inward, swallowing the halls in shadow. The sculptor lit a single lamp, its weak glow barely reaching the edges of the room. He began a slow chant, rhythmic and deliberate, carrying resonance through the broken corridors. The shinobi took his place near the veranda, blade ready, senses alert. The fog inside the temple moved differently now,
curling around statues and pillars, carrying faint echoes of voices, steps, and the unspent memories of those who had fallen here long ago. Then the figure emerged. It was not fully human, nor fully